Hello and a very warm welcome to FTA Day 2020. My name is Dawn Tan and I'll be your host today for what is the Singapore Business Federation's first ever FTA virtual event right here online with you. The COVID-19 outbreak has caused a great deal of difficulty and disruption all over the world, and particularly for global trade. And it's really put into focus the need and the importance for modern trade agreements, and specifically because we need them for recovery. So in this current environment, we have a great deal of instability, we have a great deal of uncertainty. Those trade agreements are going to pave the way for some of that support that we need to go forward. To open today's session, we're joined by Mr. Ho Meng Kit. He's CEO of the Singapore Business Federation.
Mr. S. Iswaran, Minister for Communication and Information and Minister in charge of Trade Relations. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a warm welcome to FTA Day 2020. It is our great pleasure to have with us today Minister Iswaran and distinguished leaders from both the public and private sectors as our panelists. We have worked closely together with the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Enterprise Singapore to organize this event, and I would like to commend you for joining us this Thursday morning and being part of this very important conversation. The themes of this year's event are building resilience in trade and investment structures and advancing with the digital economy. These are pertinent issues in an increasingly dynamic business environment that is beset by geopolitical tensions, trade protectionism exacerbated since COVID-19, and the increasingly pervasiveness of digital technology in our lives. Businesses have realized from recent developments the importance of building resilient supply chain and business models, in part through entering new markets and securing new supply sources. Internationalization is not only a key engine of growth for Singapore businesses looking to expand beyond the confines of our domestic economy, but increasingly a means to diversify market-specific risks and reduce exposure to unexpected black swan events. Singapore's network of more than 20 FTAs are important tools that connect our businesses to the global economy, lowering barriers to trade and investment, providing greater regulatory certainties, and giving our businesses a competitive advantage in foreign markets. The latest National Business Survey of SBF shows that the presence of FTA are amongst the top 3 considerations among businesses considering expanding overseas, alongside with increasing demand as well as the availability of low-cost labor. On the digital trade front, Singapore is co-leading negotiation with Australia and Japan on a WTO e-commerce agreement. Singapore has also recently signed 2 digital economy agreements, one with Chile and New Zealand and another with Australia. These DEAs address a broad range of topics related to the digital economy, including cross-border data flow, digitalization of trade documentations, and e-invoicing. These agreements enhance the opportunities for business to transform and tap into opportunities in the global digital economy. We encourage businesses to seize the benefits of our FTAs and DEAs and take these opportunities to build more resilient and forward-looking business models. We understand that it can be a daunting task to navigate and understand the FTA. We at SBF are committed to helping businesses at all stages of their FTA journey, whether they are looking at how to get started or having already encountered issues while using FTAs. We launched Global Connect at SBF with the strong support of Enterprise Singapore to partner Singapore businesses looking to expand and deepen into overseas market. Our Global Connect at SBF team has been working hand in hand with Singapore businesses in identifying potential markets, connecting them to in-market contacts, and business opportunities and advising them on their market entries and business expansion plans. The FTA Education and Outreach Team, which sits within our Global Connect at SBF initiative, has a series of programs and initiatives, including today's FTA Day event, that will inform our businesses how to leverage FTA more effectively. The department also runs a complimentary FTA advisory services for Singapore companies. To date, we have provided more than 150 individualized advisories on a wide range of issues, from the applicability of specific FTAs to resolving issues with tariff preferences applications. This morning, we have a great lineup of business leaders and government officials across the field of trade, investment, and the digital economy. And I look forward to their insights and how they see businesses tapping onto the benefits of Singapore's FTAs and DAs to become more globally competitive. Thank you once again for joining us today, and I wish you all a fruitful FTA Day 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ho. That was Mr. Ho Meng Kit, the Singapore Business Federation's CEO. Let me read you a little quote here. As a small city-state that has grown and prospered by staying open and connected, we are deeply cognizant that closing our doors to the world is not an option for Singapore. Free trade is in our DNA. Now, those are the words of Minister S. Iswaran, and I'm pleased to have him here with us today to share his thoughts and insights on this very important topic of ensuring resilient supply chains and strengthening trade connectivity during this COVID-19 pandemic that has impacted us all in one way or another. Minister, may I invite you to share your opening remarks with us?
Thanks. Morning, Dawn, and morning to everyone who's tuned in, friends and colleagues from the industry and also from the various agencies. I'd like to keep my remarks fairly concise, primarily to emphasize a few key points which I think are worth reiterating in the current environment, and then really to seg into questions that are pertinent and uppermost on your minds. So let me just start by saying that obviously we are in a challenging economic environment, and how we emerge from this is going to depend critically on the manner of our response. And that is true of countries, and it is true of the global economy. Because if we treat this as a reason or an excuse to retreat into inward-looking policies, then while that might give us some short-term sense of, righteousness in the case of some, in the long term, it is going to do great harm to the potential for growth, opportunities, and the raising of living standards for all our people. This is true whether you're a small country or a big country, because ultimately we need the global connectivity in order to realize the full potential, leveraging off each other's competitive advantage in order to create a bigger whole, so that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So I think that requires both political will and a certain level of courage and conviction on the part of citizens and governments. Because if it is hard in normal times to talk about free trade, then it is even harder when the economic environment is more challenging. And yet, we have to make the case to stay the course, because that is the only way we can ensure the continued global connectivity and the opportunities that we all seek out. So that is why, in the case of Singapore, we have persevered with our global strategy of how to integrate more with economies. You know about our FTAs, 25 FTAs covering about 85% of global GDP, and they yield tangible value to our companies. MTI estimates, I think in 2018, about $1.2 billion of tariff savings. But they actually offer us a lot more than that. Because when you have FTAs, individual FTAs give us bilateral advantages, but when we have this network of FTAs, it also creates an important overall network effect, which enhances the value proposition of countries and economies that sit at the nodes of these networks. And Singapore is one such country. So it's critical that we continue on this path, and this is why Singapore continues on various initiatives, including, for example, we concluded the EU-Singapore FTA a year or so ago, and we are persevering with the RCEP and so on, because these are important initiatives that will signal to the world that it's not just Singapore, but our like-minded partners remain committed to the cause. I would say that we are now bringing this openness and connectivity into the digital domain, because that is really the new frontier for global trade and economic progress. Whilst our past FTAs have focused on the movement of goods, the movements of services, and so on, tariffs, etc., I think we increasingly need to look at the movement of data, of bits and bytes. We need to increasingly look at how the different systems are interoperable, in other words, interoperable standards, and how we can then facilitate those digital flows. So whether it is e-commerce, whether it is e-payment solutions, whether it's about businesses using their corporate ID, etc., cross borders, etc., it is important that we are able to facilitate that. And there are different measures about how much the digital economy is going to grow by, but all the measures are consistently predicting a surge. And I think our COVID-19 experience has reinforced this, which is that, if you look at it, businesses have seen the value of digitalization. And in fact, I've said in another forum, especially with regard to SMEs, in the past, when we used to talk about digitalization, SMEs used to give us a polite hearing and treat it as, well, okay, it's a nice to have. And then I think it's become a kind of good to have. But these days, they all recognize it's a must-have for now and for the future. So that's a very important transition, and I think it then creates a very fertile ground on which we can build a stronger digital platform for Singapore's economic future. So this is an area we want to work on. And whether it is our traditional FTAs or our digital economy agreements, we want to make sure that our companies are able to fully benefit from them. This is why this event, like the FTA Day and the work that the SBF is doing, and also what MTI, Enterprise Singapore, and our various other economic agencies are doing, is key. Because it's not just about securing agreements with other countries. It's about ensuring that as a result of that, our businesses are now able to take advantage of those agreements, understand what they are, where are the areas where they stand to gain, and to take full advantage of those provisions. And this is why SBF's efforts with the business community is an important part of this overall strategy that we have embarked on. And this FTA Day is, I think, a very important initiative because it serves as an important crescendo, if you like, in the annual calendar, where we are able to synthesize the different trends, bring it to the attention of the business community, and have an opportunity for us to engage and interact like we are doing now. So this is altered circumstances. Usually we'll be in a big conference room and we can talk to each other and see each other. But I think whether it's virtual or physical, I think the spirit remains the same. And I'm looking forward to having a very good conversation with all of you. No.
Minister, thank you very much for those opening remarks. So let's take a deep dive into the topic of FTA Day 2020, which is building resilience through FTAs. And I want to make reference to the point that you were making with regards to this push into the digital world and what COVID-19 has done for us. The business community was already being encouraged to explore overseas opportunities before this pandemic. this has kind of pushed them over to the other edge. Should they still be considering exploring overseas business in this environment, as uncertain as it is?
So I think, in a way, there are two things here. One is digitalization, and the other is internationalization. And in the past, to some extent, there was a tendency to think of the two as separate strategies. One is, how do I get my business processes onto digital platforms, and so maybe I start with e-commerce or online marketing, and then I get into e-payments and so on and things like that. And then internationalization was seen as a separate track, because I have to assess a market and then decide whether I want to set up shop there and so on. But increasingly, I think the two really fused, and you could say that businesses are born global today, or at least born international, because the moment you start a business, you now have the opportunity to market your product, your services, your capabilities on digital platforms that access global markets. It also gives you the opportunity to strike partnerships with partners from around the world, because now you're not limited by having whether you have the resources to access that market. It's a lot easier. So the barriers have been reduced significantly. So I think if I could just say this, naturally, businesses in this current environment, their primary focus would be on how am I going to survive this downturn. MTI has projected that this year our economy will contract between 5 to 7%. That's quite a severe contraction. But at the same time, I would say that even as businesses are dealing with this, what are going to be the highest priorities? How do I reduce cost? How do I enhance my supply chain resilience? And how do I secure new markets and opportunities? And for all of this, actually, digital strategy and digitalization makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. Because with digital strategies, you will be able to operate more efficiently. Perhaps, for example, subscribing to cloud-based services for certain aspects of your business. You will be able to access new markets because you can go onto these online platforms and market your products and services. And at the same time, you are now also able to strengthen your resilience as a business, because I'm able to diversify my supply chains in a way that perhaps I never was able to. Mm-hmm. So for all these reasons, I think it's very important for our businesses to take this not just as a short-term challenge to be overcome, but also as a long-term opportunity which we can use to build our resilience, as you put it, and our competitiveness for the future economy of Singapore.
So talk to me then about the relevance of the existing FTAs that we have, the 25 or so that we have. In an environment where we do have a couple of DEAs now and more are in the works, how do companies leverage on the existing FTAs still in this very changeable world? We keep talking about transformation.
So this is where I think today's sessions are going to be very important, plus the work that MTI has been doing, putting out information on MTI and ESG, on information on our trade agreements. There's also a tariff calculator and so on, or converter, etc. And they've now got it on a mobile platform. But what's the crux of it? The crux of it is this. We have these agreements. Now our businesses must be able to take advantage of them. So what it means is, if I'm a business, I first have to decide which are the markets I'm interested in, based on my strategy and my assessment of opportunities. And then it's basically taking reference from, do we have FTAs that cover those markets? And if they do, then, and there's a good chance they will because we cover 85% of global GDP, then the next question will be, so what are the elements in there? So very often the elements include market access provisions like, tariff concessions. So we must make sure that we are able to, declare our goods. There are all these technical terms like rules of origin, etc. Basically to make sure that your products are eligible for those tariff concessions. There are trade facilitation arrangements under these FTAs, which make it easier for businesses to transact across borders. And there are other aspects of these agreements which give you greater protection for your investment, because there are usually some investment protection clauses or sections, chapters in these agreements. So understanding this in detail for the market that you're interested in is important. It's a bit like, like any other due diligence any business would do, but this is in the context of the market that you are interested in and the FTAs. And I would say that in the current environment, it's, perhaps even more salient, because you will be looking for more opportunities. Singapore has always been a market, but we have also acknowledged that Singapore is always going to be not a very big market. So you have to use Singapore as the base, but from Singapore then the world is our oyster. So we have to think in those terms. The other aspect of this would be that you don't have to navigate this on your own. And this is why I wanted to emphasize the fact that the government is very cognizant of the fact that our businesses must benefit from this. Because when the businesses benefit, they have opportunities, and then they're able to create job opportunities for our people as well. So there's a compelling business and people-centric reason why we are doing this. So what we want to do then is MTI, provides not just informational assistance, but we also have, for example, grants for them to get consultancies in order to, market readiness assistance, we call it, but in the context of FTA, and getting expert advice if you need it in order to assess this better. And we also have the work that we do with partners like the trade associations and chambers like SBF, and there are others as well. Because this is really to bring these high-level agreements closer to our businesses. Because in the end, that's what counts. And in particular, our focus is on SMEs, because the big businesses tend to have the resources and the nous to know how to navigate and derive the benefits. With the SMEs, they may be keen, but they may not know how to do it or not have the resources to do it. And this is where the assistance that we are rendering, both as government, but importantly in partnership with the business community, I think is key.
We've spoken in the past, Minister, about the importance of rules-based multilateralism. That was before the COVID-19 pandemic. So much has changed since then. That conversation has become even more, has crystallized in terms of its importance, in terms of how important these modern trade agreements are going to be. And yet we do see this sort of split, depending on where you are in the world, in terms of attitude about free trade and its value. We don't have a choice. You've said free trade is in our DNA. Singapore is all about free trade. How concerned are you about this rise of what you've termed, the nativist rhetoric and this populist pressure that we're seeing around the world?
I think it's something we need to take seriously, because if it continues unchecked and if it gathers a great deal of momentum, then you do have the risk of fracturing of the global economy, disruptions that can be quite severe to supply chains, and in general, significant dampening of global opportunities. Because if you think about the global economy, a lot of the progress that we've seen over and the growth that we've seen over the last several decades, certainly post-World War II, but even in more recent times, is because of this effort to create multilateral institutions supported by all countries, and in particular the major powers, because they recognized that this was in the common interest of the global community, and what we need to do is really create opportunities where we can work with one another for the betterment of all our people. But to do that in a fair way hence rules-based. So it doesn't matter how big you are, what your competitive advantages, etc. You can engage the global community and knowing that there's a rules-based system and knowing that there are mechanisms for redress if you feel that the rules have not been observed. And this is why, for example, the WTO is an important part of that global economic architecture, because you really need an institution where there is global membership and a commitment to abide by the rules. And the WTO also has dispute resolution mechanisms and other channels, including a tribunal, where if there are disputes, they can be taken up and resolved. So once we have that architecture, it creates a baseline from which we can do more. But if you don't have that, then it becomes a much more challenging environment, because it's more about what can we negotiate bilaterally, individually, and so on. Bilateral agreements, regional agreements are important, but they are important as complements, as supplements to a multilateral system. Because in the end, and that's always been Singapore's strategy, we are ardent proponents of a rules-based multilateral system because we see that as the bedrock of global trade and economic architecture. And then we want to overlay on that bilateral and regional agreements, because we know from experience that these agreements can help us push the frontiers faster, working with like-minded partners. So you pull them together and you create a much better outcome for everyone. So this is therefore the work that we are doing in not just Singapore, but working with like-minded partners. Then there are several aspects I can highlight. One of them is in the WTO itself. How can we ensure that WTO remains relevant? So there's this joint statement initiative that we have with Japan and Australia, which is really to bring e-commerce into the WTO and establish standards. It's a little bit late because e-commerce has been around for a while, but better late than never. And I think more importantly, the process will then start establishing parameters and norms about how to think about these issues and socialize everybody, and then we can move on to other things relevant to the digital economy. And also that is why we are working on some of the other regional initiatives like RCEP, which we hope to sign. And I think that, again, is to demonstrate the momentum is there. So we have to make common cause with like-minded partners. And there are many around the world whom I think are thinking about this. Even at the start of COVID, we're coming out with statements about keeping supply chains open, working with partners for that. I think that was an important example of making sure that the global community stands up to say that, look, we know that there's this instinct to turn inward, but we must stay open.
And how confident are you, Minister, about that spirit of collaboration? Because what I hear you say is a lot of how we recover and go forward hinges on integration, on belief that that collaboration is going to work, is going to be good for everybody. How confident are you?
I would say, if you're in this business of trade, which many of my colleagues from MTI will tell you, you have to be an optimist. Because if you decide to be pessimistic, then it makes your life
game over.
a lot harder, You have to believe in the opportunities and the possibilities. But I don't think it's an optimism. It's an optimism that's born out of a recognition of the realities and what can be done, not just about potential, but what we have seen happen in the past. So we know what can be accomplished and how it can benefit and how it can cascade, the benefits can cascade. So the key is making sure people see this and understand it. And I would say an important additional point is this. Whilst we talk a lot about free trade and the benefits, if we are really to be confident about the way forward and the opportunities that are being created, we must make sure as a government and as a people that we are also investing in the capabilities of our businesses and the skills of our people. Because when you trade, there are going to be winners and losers. That's inevitable. We have to mitigate the impact on the companies or the individuals who may feel that this is working against them. And how do we do that? Not by resisting this, but by helping them to adapt to it, and in fact, not just adapt, but pivot into opportunities from it. And that's key.
When we talk about FTAs, there is a sensitive issue about it as well, which is the employment of foreign employees from certain nationalities and so on. How do FTAs impact workers and jobs, particularly in that sense that we know that we need that contribution from workers from other nationalities?
So I think the starting point, and I want to emphasize this, our starting point of our FTAs is really this. We are embarking on this because we want to benefit our businesses and create opportunities for our people. If we don't accomplish that, then frankly it's a bit of a moot exercise. Because why do all of this if the benefits do not crystallize for our enterprises, and also if it doesn't result in jobs and career possibilities for our people? So that's the starting point. So when we embark on these FTAs, first there are those bilateral benefits, because with individual countries there are ways we can do more together. But the network value is something that should not be underestimated either. Because when we have this portfolio of FTAs with Singapore at the node, we also become an attractive location for not just businesses that want to do business in Singapore, but they want to do business through Singapore in the region or even internationally. And that is why we have, I think, at last count, about 900 or so regional headquarters here. And they're here not because of just Singapore and what we have to offer as a market, but also because they see the value of Singapore's economic connectivity through these FTAs. And that in turn then creates new types of job possibilities, because it's no longer just about local jobs, but regional jobs, international jobs, different kinds of functions, etc. And I think we're all very familiar with the various new possibilities that are being created. Then I think when it comes to the flow of talent, our approach has always been this. What we want to do is first make sure that our people have the skills and the know-how to benefit fully from these opportunities, which is why we invest heavily, not just in pre-employment training, but continuing education and, Skills Future and, the Tech Skills Accelerator program, etc. I can give you a whole laundry list of these. But essentially, what we are doing is we are investing heavily in our people, both fresh graduates, but also mid-career Singaporeans, to give them the wherewithal to seg into these new opportunities and get the most out of it. So that's key. And if we don't do this, then I think it weakens our case, because at the end of the day, we want to have that Singapore core in the economy. Now, we have also said very clearly that our Singapore core must be complemented with a judicious complement of talent from abroad. We need that for, I can think of at least a couple of reasons. The first is sometimes we just have a talent deficit, right? This is apparent, for example, in in the tech sector, because the sector is moving so fast. There's a global shortage. Singapore is no exception. And no matter how hard we try and train our people, you're still going to have the gap. And we need to find ways to complement our local talent pool carefully, but in a very effective way. But another reason why we need the talent from overseas is also for greater diversity for international functions. So for example, when Google comes to Singapore and it talks about their 1 billion user plan, they're looking at the whole region. And it creates great opportunities for Singaporeans, but it also means that they want to bring in people from abroad who will complement the Singapore team, because they need those capabilities to have that broader international strategy. So our approach has always been focus on opportunities for Singaporeans, make sure that we can get the most out of it, but allow for a judicious complement of talent from abroad.
Minister, as you know, we have a large group of registrants who've signed on today to join us for this session, and we've got some questions coming in. Let me take the first one that is on this list for you. This participant says, with accelerated digitalization, businesses in ASEAN are increasingly engaging online services and exchanging data online.
Yep.
This person wants to know if we should be expecting regional or even international standards to enable the movement of that data.
Indeed. So I think this is an important area. Data is a key resource in the digital economy. If you might be aware that we have just tabled in Parliament amendments to our Personal Data Protection Act, precisely for this reason. Because at the end of the day, if data is to flow across, countries must have the confidence that the other jurisdiction is going to treat the data with the same kind of care and protection as they would accord it in their own jurisdiction. And that means you need standards that can then talk to each other. There are some standards already in the world, like the GDPR in Europe. There's some mixed opinions about whether that is as business friendly or not, and so on. And we've also got the APEC CBPR, which is something that we have taken reference from. And I think within ASEAN, there's a greater recognition of this, and we're working with our partners. And again, it's as I said before, we might be able to accomplish some of this as ASEAN as a whole, and some of it maybe with specific partners. Now that you've got more and more unicorns, so for example, Indonesia has got unicorns, and Thailand has got unicorns, etc. These unicorns will also want to have that flow. It's not just Singapore.
Yes.
And so I think what we're going to see is a greater push in this direction. The shape and form, I think, is something that we'll have to see how it evolves.
The digital landscape is still a risky one for businesses, and we're concerned about cybersecurity and so on. That's something that is in Singapore, we certainly pay great attention to that. It exposes businesses to cyber threats, and this person wants to know, how can Singapore develop checks and balances to safeguard businesses from all this risk?
So I don't think we can have a foolproof system. That's a starting point, I would say, because first, as you digitalize, the digital footprint is growing, and that means the surface that is exposed to the risk of cyber threats is also increased. And at the same time, the nature of these cyber threats is constantly evolving. So it's kind of like an arms race, the potential cyber attackers are developing the capabilities, the solution providers and those who are defending are also raising capabilities. And I think you're going to see this to be the case for some time to come.
Yeah, it's a constant game of catch-up.
Exactly. So what I would say is this: our focus is at the national level, system level, critical information infrastructure must be protected. So this is where CSA has focused a lot of its effort, Cybersecurity Agency. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we want to work at the enterprise level, make sure the businesses have got, we are rendering a lot of advice on pre-qualified solutions, etc., on what they can do. So when the SMEs Go Digital program, some of the solutions therein are cybersecurity related. And the third, and so we want to make sure businesses understand what they need to do to secure themselves, even as we say, look, let's go digital. And then the third is at the individual level. All of us have to be, also smart digital citizens. So it's about passwords being strong, not a string of 8s or something like that, or your birthday or something like
your
that.
pet's name.
Yeah, or whatever, and so on. Because those things are very easy to, hack and so on. And also having these two-factor authentication. And the last point I would make is the thing that we are working on is also internationally, working with the UN and working with ASEAN and other partners now to strengthen international understanding and agreements on what are the norms that will govern state behavior in cyberspace. And that's an important part of the work we're doing.
What gives Singapore leverage, though, to sort of lobby for better transparency with its ASEAN partners in this regard?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's not about us having a leverage per se, but it's a recognition of the fact that we are only as strong as the weakest link, you see. Because at the end of the day, take financial services, for example. Yes, you can focus on your own system, but if there's a vulnerability in another person's system, some of that vulnerability may well find its way into your system because of how interconnected we are. So it is in our collective interest to share and to build each other's capacity in these areas. And I think there's a broad recognition of that, but it's a question of how you now translate that into concrete action steps.
Right. One of the participants on that point of collaboration with our other ASEAN member states asks, how can we encourage ASEAN member states to quicken the harmonization of regulatory regimes in ASEAN? Currently, there seem to be numerous delays, and there's no penalty for AMS who don't keep pace with the AEC scorecard.
So I think this is a case of, as I've said before in some other fora, you've got to decide whether it's a glass half empty or half full. And the way we have approached this is we've got an ASEAN agreement, which is better than not having one. And then working with our partners and those who are prepared to move faster, we can do more together. And so that's one of the areas that we are focused on. So whilst we have the ASEAN agreement, like the multilateral agreements as a kind of anchor, we can then move faster in certain areas. And this is where I think our businesses should signal through SBF or to our economic agencies which markets are of particular interest to them, so that we can focus our efforts on moving on those faster, within ASEAN even, and see whether we need to do more, because what we do there could be a very good demonstration effect for the rest of ASEAN and beyond.
Right. There's a question here with regards the restrictions. I mean, there have been plenty of border restrictions, so trade has been impacted by that alone during this COVID-19 pandemic. But not all companies, not all customers need to see you, but not, this particular person asks, not all commodity products can be sold online, right? So machines and system integration plants, they need several meetings to test and trial. It's been tough for people to travel. I don't think any of us has had a chop in our passport for a very long time, definitely not in 2020. But quarantine's blocking that process. There's a lot of frustration out there, I think, for some business leaders who can't travel right now. So how are we going to solve this?
So I think you've heard the Minister for Transport outline our strategy. And first I would say all of us have to exercise some patience, because you have to find that balance between wanting to open up because of the economic imperative and wanting to make sure our population stays safe from the infection and the healthcare perspective. If you swing too much towards protecting the health, the economy will suffer. If you swing towards opening the economy in a very quick way without appropriate safeguards, the health will suffer. So as the Minister for Transport and the government has outlined in general, we are working on a systematic way of opening up travel. So we've got reciprocal green lanes with certain countries. We've opened up unilaterally with some countries. So even if they have not opened up with us, we are prepared to accept travel from them. We are now working on other arrangements like a travel bubble, say for example with what's been mentioned about Hong Kong and so on. I think you will see more of this happening in the months ahead. But I think if the question is, can we accurately say when we will go back to status quo ex ante before this happened, I think that's a tough call, because it depends on so many things, not just about vaccines, although that's important, but also about the ability for countries to have reliable testing, rapid testing, and then the ability to trace and then treatment. So our investments in the testing and tracing, all the things that you've seen, are a very important part of our total effort to help Singapore emerge from this faster and open up faster. But we have to do this with care, always keeping an eye on the health and safety of our people.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. We've had to go back to the drawing board with understanding how to deal with all of these issues, the complexity of it, and realizing just how integrated everything is in so many industries, our healthcare industry, our economy, businesses, they're all integrated in one way or the other. They're impacting, these issues have impacted them. This participant asks, I mean, this is in relation to the idea of them going overseas. If they can get overseas, if they can actually manage to do business with a company in another land, is there any government platform that we can use to check the credibility of companies or any government agency? Can they do credit checks in order to reduce fraud when starting a new business overseas? Because perhaps they do want to go over. It's just they may have even been approached.
Yes, indeed. So I think this is a very pertinent point. This is why we are doing all these digital agreements, because, you know, for example, if we can have an understanding of recognizing each other's corporate ID and some of the e-data, you know, because you spend a lot of time on KYC and KYB, you know your customer, know your business partner, and so on, right? So the digital element is to try and take away some of the uncertainty in that by creating these common recognized platforms. So I would say, first, I'm not an expert in this space. I would say if you are really serious about exploring an opportunity, please talk to our people in Enterprise Singapore. I think, or SBF may have some advice as well. I think that's a good way to go forward. The second thing I would say is, in terms of our own work, and what I would advise you is, your banks and they will also have counterparties in these countries, so they can in turn also use their network to get more information. Because in the end, it's about doing due diligence on whom you're going to partner and establishing that they're bona fide and they've got the financial standing. And I think in this respect, your bankers will also be important partners for you.
Right. Do your homework first.
Yeah.
It's a good advice for all of us. Minister, thank you very much
you.
for sharing your thoughts and for being here with us today. And on behalf of our many participants who are watching right now, please accept our appreciation for coming here today and showing us why free trade agreements and, of course, those digital economy agreements, those are very exciting. A wonderful new frontier, as you said,
Indeed.
what they're going to do for us going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
So there you have it. Minister Iswaran there speaking to us about the importance of modern free trade agreements and those exciting DEAs. The way ahead is going to be hallmarked by collaborating with each other. That's partly what I heard the minister say. Forging those new partnerships, they're more important than they ever were before, whether it's here in Singapore, regionally and globally as well. And that's despite the populist policies and pressure that you may have experienced or seen. You know, we've seen it all in the headlines, haven't we? Well, creating those new opportunities through existing free trade agreements, there are plenty of them that you can take advantage of, and significantly those digital economy agreements. We're going to be talking a little bit more about those DEAs later on in our second panel, so stick around with us for that. Now that DEA, just a little bit about that. It's kind of a new idea. You know, in the past year or two, hardly anyone had heard of these digital economy agreements. We don't have a lot of them just yet, but clearly, with all that has happened in this COVID-19 world where we're doing so much virtually, so much remotely, maybe many of you are at home watching us right now, it breaks new ground. And we can sense it, as Minister said, it's that new frontier that's going to set this new global benchmark for trade rules. Exciting times, because it's going to reduce the barriers to digital trade. And you know, the participant earlier with the question saying, hey, you know, not everything can be sold online. What if you can't go online? What do you do then? That's also very important. I think the pressure for everyone, for the business community to understand, how can I take my business digital? They might come against some, you know, sort of stumbling blocks on that one. So don't forget that the Singapore Business Federation is here to, you know, sort of discuss your issues with you. If you have questions about that, I think it's important for everyone to kind of use the resources that are at hand. As Minister Iswaran was saying, you've got to do your homework. We've got to go back to the drawing board, actually do our due diligence. Those wonderful ideas, they're there, they're excellent, but can they work? Will they work? There are lots of people who can actually help you So this pandemic has also vaulted us into the other side of the digital transformation landscape. But things are going to settle down eventually. As Minister alluded to, we do have that shared responsibility to uphold, to update not just ourselves, upskill ourselves. I'm sure you've been hearing that one as well, no matter what industry you're in, but also update the global trading system. Prosperity on this planet, hey, I think it's going to depend very much on that shared responsibility. All right, so on that note, let's begin our first panel discussion for the day. The topic for this discussion is building resilience in trade and investment structures. Now, we face this unprecedented challenge because of COVID-19, as we've been saying this morning, but there are things that you can do that can make a difference. A commitment to maintain an open trade channel, a strong network of FTAs as well can mitigate the challenges, remove some of that uncertainty that's been building up and continues to. We want to get to that post-COVID-19 world, don't we? How are we going to navigate it? My distinguished panel today are here to discuss that very topic with us. Let me introduce them to you. Now, first of all, we've got to my left Ms. Eunbi Kim, Director General of Trade at the Ministry of Trade and Industry Singapore. Mr. Gautam Banerjee, Senior Managing Director and Chairman of Blackstone. And also we have Mr. Jeffrey Tan with us this morning, Head of Corporate Development and Technologies, YCH Group. And Her Excellency Jo Tyndall, High Commissioner to Singapore, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, New Zealand. And last but not least, Ms. Angelia Chu, founder and partner, AC Trade Advisory. Welcome to all of you. Good to see you here this morning. I hope you're all doing well. So before we begin our discussion, I'd like to invite each of you to give your opening thoughts to us on today's topic. And Kim, perhaps I can start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn, and a very good morning to everyone here. I'm very happy to be here for the second FTA Day. I think many of us were also at the inaugural FTA Day last year in Shangri-La, where Singapore celebrated 20 years of FTA strategy. Today's topic I thought was very pertinent for this panel, building resilience in trade and investment structure. I'd like to offer two comments. One, that being open and staying connected is critical in order for us to achieve that resilience. This is a very long-held position of the government. We, as a small city-state, that is not an option to close our borders. We have always stayed open, and as trade is our lifeblood. We have, ever since we started trading, opened our doors to the world. And I think we did the right thing, because when globalization happened and international trade took off, Singapore was in a good position because we were all plugged in with our open sea lanes and air links. The point I'm trying to make here is that it's because Singapore has been connected to the world markets that from the earliest day that we can strive and thrive as a trading nation, that we can become an attractive investment location, which promotes business activities here, which brings with it know-how, technology, and therefore adding ballast and strength to the economy and making us resilient. Which then brings me to the second comment that I have. Just as trading patterns change, Singapore's trade strategy also evolved to keep up with the times. It is very important that we consistently look out and respond to the global environment in order to address business needs, in order to take into account changes in companies' operation, even as they adjust to new business reality. I think earlier on my minister touched on DEA. Indeed, trade has moved on from physical world to the digital realm, and this is something that we are also paying a lot of attention to and that we will also be responding to. So in the context of the trade strategy, you see that we have moved from joining the WTO to establish link with countries around the world, to building a network of FTAs, to now breaking new grounds on negotiating digital economy agreement. The evolving trade strategy will continue, but I think the point I want to make here is that the key consideration is that it always would have to enhance opportunity for companies, that it will provide them the option to diversify their markets, their sources of supply, and in that process, secure economic resilience. Ultimately, the aim is to make the country and our business more competitive and stay relevant to the world. I'm excited to share more about this as I have been intimately involved in the early days of this trade strategy, and to speak a little bit more about how it can help companies, especially in this uncertain time, to navigate the environment. Please be on the panel. Thank you, Don.
Bee Kim, thank you very much, Ms. Ng Bee Kim there. Mr. Gautam Banerjee.
Thank you, Don. Again, very happy to be here. It's obviously critical that we keep borders open and trade going. But I'd like to just cast our mind back even before the pandemic crisis, before the pandemic hit us, because actually the world was not in a very good position, because we had issues with the two biggest economies, the US and China, with their trade war, and the whole geopolitical situation was also quite a bit strained. So we were coming into this crisis not from a very strong position. And once the pandemic hit us, obviously primarily a health crisis, but it soon became both a trade and an investment crisis as well. Trade because borders started closing, supply chains not as strong and resilient as we thought they would be. They'd never really been stress tested the way the crisis brought upon a huge stress. And the situation is that, if trade gets impacted, or it also the mindset of companies change, FDI flows get impacted. The G20 did a study around March, April, early on in this crisis, and predicted that trade would be down by at least 30 to 40% this year. And not because of the crisis itself, it's because the fact that it's really a reflection of what the crisis brings about. I mean, costs of moving goods have increased. The ability to move goods is not as easy as it was prior to the crisis. Things that we often don't know hit us, because these days a lot of air freight is moved by passenger aircrafts. Passenger aircrafts, the big aircrafts like the 777s and the 350s have huge belly holes. And if airlines cut down their flights by 96%, the huge capacity of air freight suddenly disappears, and just in time supply chains get affected. So the both in FDI and trade has been affected. And the way to deal with this, of course, is that we have to deal with the pandemic. And that is obviously, again, as Minister said, it really requires everyone to cooperate, and we are as strong as our weakest link, as he said, and I think that's very, very true. But I think it's not all gloom and doom. I think this gives us an opportunity to relook at the way we've been conducting businesses globally, relook at our supply chains, look at how we can perhaps move to a different kind of paradigm using more digital means. Trade still is a lot about paperwork. There's a lot of paperwork. There's trade facilitation, trade financing. I think there's a lot of scope for automation, and we can talk about this as we progress. So it's not about only gloom and doom. It's a chance for us to remake and realign some of these ways of doing business. Don.
Thank you, Gautam. Jeffrey?
Yeah, thank you, Don. Good morning, everybody. It's a privilege to be here to discuss such a topic during these unprecedented times. The group itself is a logistic company, a third-party logistic company, but we have never heard so much people spoke about supply chain, for the longest time, especially during this period. Ministers talk about it, professionals talk about it. Supply chain has been part of the focus for for this era. And the group itself, from its humble beginnings, we are a transportation company. But today we have grown to become the supply chain management partner for a lot of the multinational clients. And what does a logistic player or a supply chain player in this case has a role to play in the entire FTA? We basically solution the entire supply chain for our client. So we look at how to really wire up all the things. Well, we could take an analogy that when the people design the buildings, the architect design the building, who are the ones that put the building together? So we are the civil engineers that puts everything together. And we solve the very key problems down to the very key issues like toggling with harmonized system codes, HS code in short that we call, from the 6-digit standards to the 10 digits that some countries actually practices. So the complexity of navigating this entire supply chain has always been in our blood. And when we take the opportunity to look at the client in terms of providing them the logistics service, we don't just look at just pure logistics. We look at a consulting angle where we actually consult the client to look at how they can plan out the entire supply chain, leveraging on what they have already planned in terms of their supplies with their suppliers, which is the complexity that we manage. We don't look at one customer, but we look at customers with their suppliers. So the complexity of that planning the entire supply chain has to work hand in hand with the FTA. And in this case, also looking at the custom clearance, the custom brokerage, and also the custom declarations. That is only one small part of the entire game. And subsequently, there are things to navigate across the border, where we have the transportation that we are looking at in terms of cross-border transportation and the complexity of managing this. In the present times of COVID, it's even more challenging in today's context, where our clients have an entire shift towards the supply chains from globalization to regionalization. And that's why we have to take a closer look at what the region could provide us, especially leveraging on regional trade facilitation agreement, and also leveraging on the trade single window in the region that has been established, like the ASEAN single window itself. So my take of it is, moving forward, we have to continue to look at exploring and leveraging on such mechanism to actually help global trade to flow. Thank you.
Jeffrey, thank you very much. That was Jeffrey Tan there. And now, High Commissioner.
Thanks very much, Dawn, and it's really great to be here today. Singapore and New Zealand have been dance partners on trade for a very long time. And I was at the inaugural FTA Day at the Shangri-La Hotel last year, and that was marking the 20th anniversary of the first FTA Singapore had signed, which was with New Zealand, and that happened to be New Zealand's only our second FTA after the one we had signed with Australia. So I think, as Minister Iswaran pointed out earlier on, New Zealand, like Singapore, is a small advanced economy, heavily trade reliant. And that means that we have, like Singapore, a very strong belief in the importance of free trade and the rules-based trading system. So over the years, we have worked together on a number of FTAs, and we've been pathfinders. There's been a lot of talk already this morning about the way that trade is evolving. So an early example of a pathfinder agreement was when we created the so-called P4 that over time developed into the TPP and then into the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So more recently, of course, the other theme that is coming through incredibly strongly already today is the shift to digital. The digital economy becoming part of the mainstream economy rather than something off to one side. And that is going to be of increasing importance as we all seek to rebuild our economies in the face of the pandemic. So we see a treaty like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the DEPA, between Singapore, New Zealand and Chile, as being a really strong foundation for us to develop the norms and standards we need as trade evolves and as we cross new frontiers. Now, all of that, I say, is a context for the very difficult situation we all found ourselves in earlier this year with the pandemic unfolding very, very rapidly. What it meant was that as the sorts of disruptions to trade that we've just been hearing about, as those disruptions to trade became very evident, very quickly, with borders closing, with international trade connections being disrupted. We were able, as the trusted partners and friends, to turn to each other and work very quickly together to patch things up and to find a bridge to maintain supplies of essential goods, in our case food and medical supplies. And that, I think, wouldn't have been possible without that strong and long-standing bilateral partnership between us, forged over many years.
High Commissioner, thank you very much for that. Food and medical supplies, I mean, at the beginning of this pandemic, I think those two commodities were in some areas in short supply. They're still in short supply in some regions of the world. So very important work that you've been doing, and I want to thank you for that work that you did at the beginning of the pandemic. Ms. Angelia.
Hi, thanks, Dawn. So I think things were very different last year. We were there last year celebrating our FTA Day. Right after the pandemic hit us, we were actually very busy encouraging the business or pushing them to use free trade agreement. We've heard countries to countries making a lot of effort to get things going. We have 3PLs like YCH facilitating. The last bit, I think the last very big piece is the business themselves to take that step forward. I would say that since the beginning of the pandemic, it has become an increasing trend to further look at how to fill the gap of sales, looking for new markets, at the same time looking for new suppliers when we talk about resilience. So in the consideration of new markets and new suppliers base, I would say the message has been quite clear to them. Look, do your homework. Look what you can do with free trade agreements. So when they start looking at how to use free trade agreements, they realize that it is not as simple as it is. It's a proactive action that they have to do, and it had to be involving multiple stakeholders, different departments in the whole organization. What is very comforting is now everyone realizes that trade is a very big, broad topic, and they need to upskill their staff, employees about trade challenges. What is international trade? In fact, HS classification is something that may not be very easily understood in the past. We have 3PL logistics that helps, but these days when you want to use FTAs, you have to look at all this country of origin, how to understand them, because your cost of your material use would affect the qualification. So I would say there is more, observation-wise, there's a lot more interest in getting their employees trained. And I would also say that individuals who are well informed or skilled or knowledgeable about this area would find themselves in a valuable position right now to contribute to the company. So we've been interacting with the businesses. For them, they need to look for new markets to fill up the gap, to grow, right? They still need to meet the KPI. What I heard is, pandemic or not, the growth target is there. So let's continue to find a new market to fill the gap. At the same time, we have to find new suppliers to make it resilient so that we knew where were our gaps in the beginning. So with this too, FTA came very useful right now, because at the same time with FTA you can buy from partner countries, and at the same time when you supply to new markets, your goods from Singapore could be more competitive. So that is what we have been observing through our conversation with clients and businesses.
Angelia, thank you very much for that. And panel, thank you very much for your opening remarks. As Angelia alluded to there, and as High Commissioner Tyndall mentioned as well, policymakers and their teams have done the hard work. They've done the hard work to get those agreements done. But how can businesses actually use them? They're the end user of all of this.
Yes.
And it can be daunting. It can be daunting because so many people are involved and at every level within a company too. So let's kick off our discussion by talking about the impact, because the business news has been dominated by the fact that COVID-19 has had this impact on trade, on investment, on supply chains, as Jeffrey was talking about. And in some cases, it has spawned even trade restrictions, threatening old trade divisions, threatening to widen those trade divisions as well. So how deeply is that impact being felt? And Gautam, I want to start off with you.
Well, I think it's natural during these times that often companies look inwards, but I think you cannot go back from a situation where manufacturing of any scale has been on a distributed platform. I mean, this, as Jeffrey said, the global supply chains, lean, just in time, have helped companies enormously in becoming competitive, in moving goods and services, and getting the best out of different economies. You have each national economy has got its own strengths and weaknesses, and global companies have used that. Use this these supply chains, the FTAs, and I'd like to say it's apart from FTAs. Tax treaties as well, investment protection that the minister talked about. All of these together help, have contributed to this very global sort of marketplace, business place that has developed over the last many years. So from that situation, I don't see companies going on to bringing things onshore. I mean, I don't think that'll happen. I mean, I think we will see changes to supply chains for sure. The fragility of supply chains will certainly have to be looked at. We will see more regional supply chains where it is more manageable rather than very distributed supply chains. Like, I think a typical, if you buy an electronic item, today you'll see things come, parts of that coming from Mexico to China to India to, even maybe New Zealand, and putting it together somewhere. I mean, those things I think people will have to look at. I mean, both in terms of, cost as well as ease of doing things and making it very agile. So that will have to be looked at. But the role of these FTAs, and that's why Singapore, I mean, Singapore has lived, trade is its lifeline. And of course, we've added a lot more to trade now. I mean, in a typical year, our trade could be 3 times our GDP. I mean, that's quite amazing, actually. But we are not much more than trading now. We've got manufacturing and so on. We've got services. I think what we will see, because of our long record of dealing with not only local businesses, but businesses from all over the world, that Singapore's built up has become a trusted hub. And I think post this pandemic, you will see the emergence of trusted hubs, which will not only be where local companies, regional companies, but global companies will operate from. And this trust is earned over many years. It is not about ease of doing business. It is about consistency of policy. It is about making sure that what was promised you got from the government and authorities, that things don't change. And that's why the amazing thing is, even though everywhere you see FDIs coming down, Singapore, I think EDB announced sometime in July, August, that we are on track for our FDIs, because some of these very large corporates who have been with us through thick and thin over the last 40 or 50 years are saying, well, I mean, we need to be near the big markets of China, Southeast Asia, India, and we need to depend on trusted hubs.
Trust has been an important
trust.
factor.
And I think Senior Minister Tharman made this point very eloquently at the Singapore summit about moving away from multilateralism, bilateralism to pluralism, where a few countries come together, and the emergence of trusted hubs. So I'm quite optimistic that we can do that. Again, great partnerships with New Zealand. I mean, we saw that in those dark days when things were not moving, we've got this, and similar countries. I mean, population about the same. Discipline. The way we both handle the COVID crisis. I think these sort of partnerships, which have been fostered over many years, I think will become very important.
They're going to continue to be important. And I want to bring Jeffrey in on the conversation here about supply chains, because you were talking about them in your opening remarks. The thing about supply chain disruption is that they've always been fragile. You know, I mean, a hurricane, a typhoon, it reinforced the vulnerability. If you had, you know, one key part that was in some part of the world and suddenly you couldn't get it anymore, what did you do? But why was this pandemic so different? And tell us more about what's being done to sort of solve that issue of the disruption.
Yeah, this is, I think, the most interesting part of the discussion. Supply chain disruption, I think I will address it in two ways. One is before the pandemic and one is after the pandemic. So before the pandemic, the focus was a lot on China. Because in supply chain, we deal with production and consumption. And has the biggest consumption in the current world? And who is the factory of the world, you know? And that sort came to a halt when the pandemic hits. Things are not getting out from China, not getting into China when the COVID hits Wuhan. And we actually was not new to this problem because before the pandemic, we are already experiencing the shift in the global supply chain. And that's because of the tensions between the major powerhouses in the world, you know, between US and China, between, you know, different discussions that's going on in terms of free trade agreement. So we see our clients, and you see in the news that, you know, manufacturing shifting to Vietnam, you know, and to ASEAN is real. Because our clients has been telling us do you have an option for me in Vietnam and Philippines, in the rest of the world in ASEAN? And that has already triggered us to look at the network of that supply chain that we are in. And also at the same time, how to mitigate the risk. So typhoons, earthquakes has hit us before. And we have been hit and managed to come up from that supply chain, you know, distress that we are in. But the COVID is a totally different situation. FTAs was not designed for the COVID situation, was not designed for this pandemic. And when the pandemic hits, we realized that FTA was a good basis, but it couldn't move the goods across the border. And we had to work closely with our clients, especially also with the authorities, to look at how some of these goods could move across border when Malaysia issues the movement control order, and that was something that hit us very badly. Yeah.
So we've got a lot of participants joining us today, and they're sending in their questions. There are a flurry of questions here, and I want to get to one of them, and perhaps, Bikim, I can address this first one to you, which is, how can businesses work better with our trade negotiators to ensure more of what they need in free trade agreements is reflected in the negotiations and agreements?
Thank you, Don. But just before I talk about this, may I just go back to
Sure.
the point that made by Jeffrey that FTAs negotiated for peacetime and that is not relevant for the pandemic. I think while it's true that the pandemic makes it more challenging in terms of the implementation of gathering goods or services from one location to another, simply because everything is all grounded and hot. I would like to make the pitch that because of FTA, it makes a difference. I'll give you an example to illustrate this. You know, our FTAs help to open markets. So it allows you to have preferential access, whether in the goods space or in services. We have an FTA with India. And PSA, for example, because of the preferential access in maritime committed by India, was able to establish itself in India, make good connections with the local companies there. And during the pandemic, because of this very strong commercial in-market relation, PSA was able to call on the suppliers to enable us to then import food and material for mass in the early months of the pandemic. I think if there weren't this FTA that allows PSA to have the foothold, we wouldn't have that commercial relationship. So indeed, it's true that things get a little bit more disrupted. But the point about FTA one have to look at is not just so much in terms of the actual market access, but how that leads to relationship building, how that leads to trust, which I think Gautam made a very strong case. And I want to sort of reinforce that point. Coming back to Don's question about how do we negotiate FTA to ensure that it would help us to stay more resilient. You will note that Singapore has been evolving our FTAs in terms of scope and the breadth of what is covered. The early days of FTA is a little bit more focused on goods. We moved on to services, and thereafter, where issues and things like intellectual property became very important intangible assets for companies. An intellectual property chapter was also included. And then, of course, the whole space on e-commerce. We're now breaking new grounds on DEA, but I will tell you, the CPTPP, which Joe touched on, already has a strong foundational chapter on e-commerce, where it talks about how we should allow data to flow across borders freely, talks about how we treat the location of data so that the company would then not have to build infrastructure across the region, but be able to consolidate and therefore enable them to power from one particular spot. One other point that I also wanted to make with respect to how FTA could help is really with the network effect. If you have an FTA, you then have an access to one country. If you have a network FTA, you have access across multiple markets. And that provides the diversification. I know COVID is a little bit different from the other crises in that it's more global and it isn't just one sector or one segment of the world is affected, but that it is the impact is felt across. But having a diversified portfolio does give you choice. It allows you to then be able to leverage and deleverage according to how the business is happening on the other side. And so as you continue to see opportunities, you can also shift as necessary the supply chain, the final markets, and so forth. Yeah, thank you.
So the extreme level of disruption that we have seen, though, it's really caused firms to seriously think about, to rethink their footprints, in terms of the supply chain, in terms of how they're actually doing business and operating. So let's talk a little bit about the opportunities that have arisen in all of this. Gautam?
Well, actually, one of the points I think should be made is that, and I know you just said that, we all suddenly started getting an interest in supply chains. But, when we had the financial crisis in 2008, it really, brought about stress tests on banks' balance sheets and financial institutions' balance sheets. And it's never been the same again in the financial industry, the way the regulators look at balance sheets, look at the way the bank's footprint works. Then we had all the cyber attacks, and that brought in the requirement for penetration testing and all of the other stuff. I believe this crisis will bring in stress testing for supply chains. I think generally speaking, companies use supply chains, and they're reason why it's so much in the fore is that it gives companies competitiveness and the ability to be agile and service their customers and other stakeholders. But we've never really stress tested supply chains in a way that we now have to stress test balance sheets for financial institutions or do penetration testing for IT systems. So that's something which we will have to take on board and do so. I think the other thing is that from that stress test of supply chains will emerge things like diversification of supply chains, looking at different ways you set it up, using more digital, reducing the dependence on paper trails and so on. So I think all of this will happen. I mean, and I think this will make us more efficient and more resilient going forward.
And Julia, can you share some of your experience in terms of the emerging potential that you've seen coming out of this?
Already we have been helping a few companies in terms of looking at the source of materials that they are buying currently and how they could actually fit into the different FTAs and then send it out to export to the new markets based on the new FTA that has been signed. I wanted to, add on to the point that Gautam made about being a trusted hub. I felt that a lot, if we want to gain trust from our partner countries, it means that our people have to uphold a good reputation of made in Singapore or made in ASEAN or having a center of excellence in Singapore. And our people have uphold integrity and good compliance. That is how we can attract global businesses to be in Singapore. So in that sense, I would say we should build on our call to upskill, continue learning, And I would say trade compliance is very, very important now for everyone who wants to do business outside of Singapore, and that we train our people well to be competitive. And I've just shared with the panelists earlier that I'm at a small company, and his general manager felt that his sales and procurement and R&D team should be trained on free trade agreements so that they could explain to the business why buying from them has an advantage compared to the competitors from another country. So it impressed us because as a small company, he's able to understand how understanding FTA and how knowing more about trade could help his company propel to the new market and be effective in communicating with the business, his customers, that use Singapore as a hub or use the FTA would help lower the cost of goods. So that kind of bring it back to why our people has to be trained and continue to upskill, especially now the international trade environment is very challenging. Getting trade compliance knowledge is important, and we have to make sure that whatever we declare is really, really true, and we maintain a good reputation as a Singapore product or Singapore export or re-export, so that our certificate of origin is well recognized. Yeah.
High Commissioner Tyndall, we've had such a long history of free trade agreements, and of course our first one with New Zealand. I think now we've got something like 25 of them.
25,
But we've got DEAs as well, these digital economy agreements as well, very exciting development that we're seeing in our digital world. Expanding networks, that's going to be so important. What can you say to some of the participants who may be watching now on how they can really leverage on free trade agreements to diversify? As Gautam was saying, we need to begin to think about diversifying our supply chains, sort of doing things a bit differently, but with this expanded network.
Thanks, Dawn. And I think I just want to begin by saying that some of the disruptions we saw earlier this year, well, in fact, we started to see trade disruptions last year, even before. Things have definitely been exacerbated by the pandemic. And we're seeing around the world an uptick, a significant rise in subsidies, application of subsidies, other barriers to trade. There's a bit of a tendency on the part of governments to look inwards, to turn inwards and protect their own sectors, and it's fully understandable. But we should look back to history, look back to the Great Depression, where back in the 1930s, I guess nearly a century ago, the closing borders actually worsened the effect and the length of time of the Depression. The way we see it, opening trade and ensuring trade remains open is critical. It's going to be critical to all of us globally recovering our economies. So from the point of view of businesses, we can see at the moment that our trade is looking pretty good overall, but we can see there are going to be headwinds in the future, particularly as it's pretty difficult to access new markets or new customers on the basis of Zoom calls. So we do think that the network that's there, and in particular an agreement like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the DEPA, provides the basis for particularly SMEs to overcome the challenges of scale and of distance in order to tap into new opportunities in markets. Equally, to make sure that they are able to trade in the most cost-effective and efficient way of doing so. If we can really set those norms and standards, as we intend to do through DEPA, for paperless trading, for e-invoicing, e-payments, digital identities, all of those things are really going to help with the sorts of outcomes that the panellists have all been talking about today, to leverage off the network that's there and to make sure that there is a kind of level playing field across the whole network of markets in terms of the conditions of market access and the basis for which trade, including digital trade, can take place.
We've all been through a lot with COVID-19. We're already at the end of October. Part of the issue of doing business is that issue of travel and the issue of restrictions, movement restrictions, of quarantine and so on. So while I've got you here, High Commissioner, there is a question from a participant about the borders between Singapore and New Zealand. Singapore opened the border to New Zealand, no quarantine needed. Are there plans underway? Can you give us a hint as to whether New Zealand is going to reciprocate? Our COVID numbers are very low right now. We're crossing our fingers that it stays that way.
I think we're all crossing our fingers on that score for sure. New Zealand, we're blessed. It's either a blessing or a curse. We have a large moat around us, and unlike Singapore, there's about 2,000 kilometres to our nearest neighbour. That moat, if you like, has been the primary policy tool we've used to manage the COVID situation. We do know and have indicated that when things are safe, we are very open to looking at easing restrictions and opening borders. But our government has made it clear that the first cab off the rank needs to be Australia. So we are in talks with Australia. There isn't yet a travel bubble between our two countries, but once things are sorted there, I think the government will then be potentially in a situation where it can look a little bit further. And I can assure you that we at the High Commission are keeping very, very close eye on what is happening here with the COVID situation, how numbers are being managed, how it's looking particularly for community transmission, and making sure that we send very detailed reports back to Wellington to inform policy making.
Okay, so whoever asked that question, watch this space. You heard it from the High Commissioner right there. So we do have lots of questions, as I mentioned earlier. Let me just quickly run through one of them here. All right, so Gautam, you mentioned this earlier, and also Jeffrey, about this issue of cargo, right? We know that some planes are actually being retrofitted so that they just carry cargo, or actually there are some, I think even SIA planes, which are carrying some passengers and also cargo, making good use of whatever aviation we can at the moment. How can free trade agreements actually help improve logistics and air cargo with all of these pandemic restrictions as they are? Who'd like to jump in on that question?
Maybe I'll take that.
Yeah.
This is about logistics.
Yeah.
So I think there are 2 points here that is important to examine. One is diversification, and one is actually a trusted hub. And on Begim's points, that it's actually about the trusted hub on top of the FTA networks that are already established by Singapore, which will help in this case to let the manufacturers, let the traders source for more options, and that's the network that's built behind. And with that network, what is going to happen for logistic players like us is to look for diversification in terms of building our own trusted hub as a network, rather than a single point as a warehouse or as a storage capacity. At the same time, connect all this trusted hub using different modes of transportation. Of course, Singapore has been well known for its air hub, sea hub. We are very good in that transportation mode. But because we are an island by itself, we are a city by itself, we didn't exploit much into the road transportation. And because of the logistic players like us involvement in G2G initiative, like the Chongqing Connectivity Initiative, we managed to participate in those land connectivity projects, in this region. And one of the things that we actually sort of piloted and sort of pushed forward is for the land border connection between the western part of China to Singapore. So we actually piloted a truck in the end of December 2018 that runs from Chongqing all the way to Singapore, crossing different countries in ASEAN. At the same time, also testing the ASEAN single window in terms of that ability to connect and transfer data. And that is done within 7 days, and it traveled 4,500 kilometers. So there's something wonderful that we think we have achieved to provide an alternative as a diversification in terms of the standard transport mode that we are very used to.
That kind of progress is something to celebrate. We have time for just one more quick question. I'd like to put this one to B. Kim. This is a question from our participants. It's a bit long. I'll just paraphrase it a bit. But major powers have in recent years put in place multiple trade restrictions that go against global trade rules established by WTO. Singapore might not be a target for now, but what if we are in the future? What can we do to protect ourselves and ensure that countries play by the rules?
So I think earlier participants have also noted that there was the trade tension was already brewing even before COVID happened, and that really COVID sort of exacerbated what's been happening in the more volatile environment. And it's true with the power contestation by major players. This is even more pronounced. One way in which we have been trying to sort of balance and hedge ourselves against some of these pressure is to enter into agreements, as many as we could, in order to sort of layer the protection upon protection for our trading relationship. So I talk about FTA, I talk about WTO. These are not just a gentleman's agreement. These are legal documents. These are legal instruments. And by legal instrument, it means to say that everybody has to abide by the code of conduct, has to abide by the certain sets of rules and standards, and take on these binding commitments. Because in the event that there is any breach of such commitment, there is a recourse. There's recourse to dispute settlement. Of course, it's not going to be pleasant. It's going to be costly, and there'll be a lot of other consideration. But the point I want to make here is that we are not completely without any agency that we can take in the event that our trade interests are being impacted.
Could I just add very, very quickly that on top of that legal basis, Singapore and New Zealand have, for example, tried to lead the way, show leadership, be kind of pathfinders. And just one example, back in March of this year, with the pandemic really creating those disruptions, our two trade ministers spoke and could see, the writing on the wall. Within 24 hours, they'd put out a joint ministerial statement committing to keep trade in essential goods open and restriction-free. And we used that as the basis for bringing more countries on board.
11.
So it's not legal. So now there are 12 that have joined that ministerial statement. And it's that sort of thing, I think, that helps mutually support and buttress up the legal basis we've got internationally.
High Commissioner, thank you very much for that. And with that, we have to wrap up this particular session. Thank you for your thoughts. It remains for me to thank my panelists for this first session, B. Kim, High Commissioner Tyndall, and Julia, Gautam, Jeffrey, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so, everyone out there, we're down, but we are certainly not out of this. One of the great lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic has been the importance of resilience. How many times have you heard that particular word said today? Many. And even our own personal resilience. We've all been trudging through this for a long time now. Don't give up. What we have heard today is that we can move towards and benefit from making those supply chains more diverse, more flexible, and more integrated. They're not cast in stone. They can move. They're like living organisms almost. So those diversified supply chains, once more resilient, just think, you get more access to raw materials from different areas, multiple production locations perhaps, multiple warehouse hubs as well, different distribution channels. There's lots of potential there. And so smart firms are actually recognizing that getting that flexibility, getting to a point where you feel you have that flexibility and exploring perhaps alternative production possibilities, that may be part of the way forward. We've got to begin to think laterally, not just vertically, horizontally, but in every direction on this in order to get to those seamless solutions that we need. All right, so let's move on to panel 2 now. Time is marching along. And so is digital transformation, that familiar term that we've been hearing for quite a while now as Singapore moves towards smart nation status. COVID-19 just pushed us over the edge into the other landscape of the digital economy and advancing in that direction. Companies and employees are having to adapt and engage and transact remotely like never before. We were going cashless before. We're pretty much cashless now. Anybody signed a check recently? Not me, but we will, you remember those things? We will find out more about these agreements, these digital economy agreements. You've heard me mention them a couple of times. If you hadn't heard of them before, they are breaking new ground, and you're going to hear a lot more about them in the future, I can guarantee you, with many, many other countries, I'm sure, as our digital economy matures, as it matures. And so to discuss how businesses can advance with the digital economy, and according to some of my panelists from the previous panel, almost every business could go digital in one way or another. That's also something that the Minister Iswaran said earlier. My panelists today with me in this studio are, first of all, Mr. Saw Ken Wai. He's Chief Executive Officer, Crimson Logic. Ms. Koli Na, Assistant Chief Executive, Strategic Planning and Digital Readiness at IMDA. Mr. Alpesh Patel, he's Partner, McKinsey & Company. Mr. Stephen Scully, Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner, Australian Trade and Investment Commission, Singapore. And last but not least, Mr. Lim Tek Yong, he's Head of Regional Operations and the People Team at Shopee. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you here today. It's like magic. You just appeared. One panel left, and you did the swap. This is the magic of the digital world, isn't it? All right, so let's start off by me asking you all to give us an overview, some remarks about our topic today, and let's start off with Mr. Saw.
Oh, thanks, Don. I applaud and thank this opportunity to talk about free and open trade and how digital can help. I mean, the way you summed it up, like digital just happened. It's been happening for a long time. I think my company is a good showcase of that. We were formed over 30 years ago to bring transformation in trade in Singapore. We built the world's first single window, looking to see how technology can be used to exchange information. We went ahead to now run about 19 single windows around the world. And this concept of paperless trade, exchanging, reusing information seamlessly to move goods around the world, it's not novel. It's been there for the last 30 years, but it's taken a long, long time. And it will still take a long time to happen because it's not a trivial process to answer. It's a conundrum because there's so many parties involved. You can get two governments to agree, but to implement takes time. And I think that's where the digital agreements actually help. It helps put the focus on sharing information, helps put the focus on how to make the flow of information more transparent across the chain, and how to make things easier for goods to flow. Because the stopping point for goods flowing seamlessly is not the traffic, not the movement, but it's the information. You don't have the piece of paper, and paper is actually bad. But it takes a lot of time to remove that paper from the system.
Thank you, Mr. Saw. Ms. Ko?
Sure, thanks, Don. So I thought I would spend a couple of minutes to give an overview of the digital economy agreements, since that's something that we've been talking about across both panels. And I will explain the why, the what, as well as where are we at right in the digital economy agreements. So why? I think I don't need to reiterate the point that with things going digital, basically there's great opportunity for businesses in the digital economy. And one of the features of digital is really this feature of being able to transcend borders, geographical boundaries. And so because of the promise of digital, enterprises now can access partners, suppliers, markets internationally a lot more easily. And so for Singapore as a country, what do we then need to put in place to make sure that we remain open and digitally connected with the rest of the world in order for the businesses then to be able to transact across borders quite easily? And this was the whole premise for us starting on this journey of the digital economy agreements. So what do I mean when I say digitally connected to the world? Of course, at the foundational layer, there is always that telecom infrastructure. Right? Without the cables, things cannot flow across borders. But building on top of that, we started to see that there are many building blocks if a business in one country wants to transact with another in another country. So simple things like, can your data flow easily across borders, right? Does the other country have rules on data localization that prevent data from coming out so that you can aggregate and analyze your regional data together? Can your payments flow across borders? What are the standards on the other side? What are the standards on this side? Can your identity, your invoices, all these different building blocks of what you need to do to transact with your partners overseas, right? Can these things flow in as low a barrier as possible across borders? And this is the why, right? Why we decided to move on this path of building Singapore's sort of lattice of partnerships with our like-minded countries overseas, with the aim of establishing some rules, common norms, harmonized standards, interoperable systems, and standards, so that when you do something in Singapore, for example, you get onto Singapore's e-invoicing network, right, based on the PEPO identity, and you have a business partner in Australia, you don't need to, like Ken said, print out the piece of paper and send the invoice over for them to then upload it, right? You can just send it through the PEPO network. It will be converted to an interoperable format, passed across, and it just goes across as one bit in the submarine cable. And that's all you need to do. And that is the whole premise of the digital economy agreements. And this is really a pathfinding kind of an approach, because these areas are new to countries. Even for Singapore, a lot of the building blocks are also relatively new to us. And that's why when we approach this with like-minded partners, we take a very pathfinding approach. Let's co-create the provisions together. And beyond that, right, what are the projects, what are the business projects that we can bring in to help the agreements come to life, right, to demonstrate that it is possible, right? If we harmonize in this way, if we recognize each other's standards in this way, actually for the business, right, it is possible to do things faster, cheaper, and better. And that is what we want to achieve at the end for businesses. Today, we have agreements with Chile, New Zealand, and Australia. And we have also started negotiations with Korea on digital economy agreements. So we do hope to do a lot more in this respect.
Ms. Koh, thank you very much. Mr. Alpesh Patel?
Well, good morning. A very pleasure to be in this panel. So a couple of remarks that I would have on digital trade trends and then potential opportunities. The first one, when we look at global trade flows, I think it wouldn't be a surprise to say that these are undergoing quite big changes. If we think about the global flows of goods, the intensity is decreasing, has decreased from 28 to 22% between 2007 and 2017. At the same time, we see that the trade of services has increased 60% faster than the trade of goods, and digital is a very big portion of that. That's even before accounting for additional elements that would actually make the trade of services, currently at 5 trillion, even bigger than what it is now, as the trade of goods includes elements like R&D, elements of services that are actually embedded and not accounted for. So actually, this is quite important, right? So that's the backdrop. And that was even before COVID-19. And if we see what the crisis has brought, is actually a 3x, 4x acceleration of this, because digitization has taken space across industries. If I take the B2C side, of course, with consumers at home changing habits, there has been an obligation to adapt, and the rise of e-commerce and other services, of course, has come. What we see is that this is not going to go anywhere. It's going to stick, and why it's going to stick, it's because some of the habits have been ingrained and actually consumers have felt that this is more convenient than the way that they were consuming before, right? So on the front end side, quite a lot of the changes that we've seen that could have taken place in 10 years have taken place in a few months and are going to stay. If we look on the back end side, well, data analytics are being used to try and optimize companies' supply chains, companies' in operations and working environment, right? So That is what COVID has brought, so an even bigger impact on the digital trade flow. If I then go to the third remark, which is what are the opportunities that stem from that? I think when it comes to Singapore can play a couple of roles. The first one is, well, it can play in the digital game. Singaporean companies are digitizing and have a role to play. I think we'll hear more later on in the various industries to be at the forefront. Second, they can be the enablers. By that, Singapore is ahead in many industries. If I take manufacturing, one of the industries I follow, in particular on Industry 4.0, a lot of transformations are taking place in Singapore that could benefit the rest of the region. So as an enabler, it has a role to play, and there is an opportunity for companies. Third, if we look at the role that digital can play in further increasing the trade of goods, there is again a role to play here, right? So e-commerce platforms, of course, can contribute from roughly 1 trillion of flows today to 2 trillion by 2030, so there could be a role there. In addition, there is a role to be played in facilitating the trades and reducing the costs, reducing the time, and that's where services such as Logistics 4.0, IoT to track the goods, and platforms that allow the exchange of information, as mentioned earlier, are really key opportunities.
Mr. Alpesh Patel, thank you very much for that. Mr. Stephen Scully.
Hi. Yes, I work for the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, part of the High Commission here in Singapore and the commercial arm. So I'll build on my fellow panelists' sort of contribution so far. I'll just talk about the Singapore-Australian DEA. I think everybody knows what DEA means now. In terms of where we've come from, what's the current status, and what are the opportunities going forward? It's interesting, we heard this morning that Singapore has 25 FTAs. Australia was one of the earlier ones in 2003, and that established a platform where goods could be imported between Australia and New Zealand with no tariffs, and there was sort of certain service sectors that were also facilitated. Interestingly enough, financial services was not one of them. Now, since then, Australia and Singapore have really forged very close government-to-government connections and also very strong commercial connections. And the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership was signed about 4 years ago. And building on Dawn's point earlier about the 4 pillars then did not include digital. And, and as part of that 4-pillar process around smart nations that Singapore had, we worked with the IMDA on some trade missions to and from Australia and produced commercial outcomes that resulted from that agreement. We're optimistic those will come out of the DEA with that has been signed. So the current status of that is it was signed, and of course it was done virtually with COVID, so that befits signing a DEA, and so Prime Ministers from both countries and the Trade Ministers did that in August. It still has to be ratified by the Australian Parliament, but that is to take place by the end of the year. I think as other people have mentioned, it is really a modernisation of the old FTAs, because when those FTAs were put in place, the whole digital economy had not really sunk in, and I think people were feeling even before COVID that we weren't maximising the opportunity that the advances in digital were really presenting to us. So the Singapore-Australia DEA will focus around 7 MOUs. Most of those are linked to facilitating greater and freer trade. So things like e-invoicing, e-certification, e-payments. It'll be also data protection, and consumer rights will be highlighted as well. And as other panelists have said, this will really facilitate a much greater digital trade process, even if it's just not done on an e-commerce platform, but if it's more physical goods, this will facilitate that process. I mentioned the seven MOUs. What is likely to come out of those is that there will be a series of initiatives which my fellow panelists from the IMDA will be charged with working with Austrade to facilitate commercial outcomes, and we hope those can take place in 2021. Things like missions, even if it's virtual or physical, we'll be looking for commercial outcomes, as I said.
Mr. Scully, thank you very much for that. Mr. Lim?
Yep, thanks, Lon. I think we first acknowledge that the businesses and retailers in Singapore and in Southeast Asia have faced tremendous challenges in this period. I think some of them have seen the opportunity to transform themselves during this digital period and gone online. And I think the point to note here is, as a leading e-commerce platform, we are super encouraged by the amount of interest and the uptick in the number of companies who have gone online during this period. And I think it's important to note that going online is not a binary process. It's not the switch of a button. You go online and that's about it. It's a journey. It's a journey that they have to go online. They learn how to operate online shops, e-commerce shops, go big on online, and eventually go overseas. So I think with all this DEA push from the government is timely, it's opportune, it really supports the businesses in going overseas and helping them secure greater certainty in where they are.
Mr. Lim, thank you very much. And panelists, everyone, thank you very much for your opening remarks on our topic today, advancing ourselves in this digital economy where we find ourselves. And Mr. Saul, you make a very good point. We have had transformation, slow and steady over the years, but it's taken a long time. But it's been sobering what the COVID-19 pandemic has done. I mean, we've faced crises before, but and as you said, Mr. Scully, I mean, the speed with which we actually got tipped over the edge, and we have to kind of look at the mechanisms that we have, the structures that we have, and then we're like, well, I mean, are these the right structures? I mean, maybe we could have done more before, but hindsight is always 2020. Sorry, I had to say that. The year 2020, we'll all remember that one. But anyway, the year is not over quite yet. We've had lots of participants joining us today, and I want to get to one of their questions because there are quite a number. This participant asks, and it's a rather long question, I'll just paraphrase it a little. Digitalization, it's important, it's opened doors, but when you look at it from an FTA perspective, it appears to be tied to traditional FTAs and the benefits that they provide. A quick query here. Has thought gone into how FTAs, which are traditionally based on the movement of goods and hence founded on ROO, etc., can they be recast to provide benefits for digital trade as well? Do we have to be signing, getting to the actual signing of the MOUs of the DEAs? Can we use existing FTAs to benefit digital trade? What if there is no direct movement of goods or of services? Perhaps, Lina, you can tackle this one.
So I will probably take it in two ways. First, I think when we talk about the work of the government to sort of facilitate the movement of goods, services, and digital flows, we are quite agile in the modality that we use. So FTAs is a very strong starting point with a strong legal basis. And in fact, the DEA negotiations that we have entered into, some of them do build on existing FTAs, recognizing that the FTAs did not fully cover what is needed in the digital economy. But outside of this FTA-DEA construct, actually, IMDA, many other agencies do enter into partnerships with our counterparts in other countries to try to just facilitate the movement of data, of goods and services. So I'll give an example of Asean, for example. That is where we have also started to advocate for common or more harmonized data sharing mechanisms across ASEAN. That sits outside of a DEA at the moment, but at the platforms that we have available to government, those will be the platforms that we use to advocate all in the same direction of trying to facilitate flows. And what are these flows? Like you mentioned, of course, there is the traditional world of just flowing goods. Right? I think Ken also alluded to it earlier. When you flow goods, actually there is a digital flow that can accompany that good, right? So when the item flows across, today you have to send your bill of lading over, right? Use the plane to fly it over, fly a piece of paper over. your certificate of origins, right? All the other documents that come with that good. Actually, tomorrow, what we are hoping to achieve is digitalize all these accompanying documentation, right? Money flows, constructs, and use digital collaborations internationally to then help them to move faster, with a much lower barrier of entry, and actually, to be frank, also a much lower error rate, right? When you can digitize and send it across without too much sort of different steps in the middle. So that is how we generally will approach this objective of really trying to just keep Singapore as open and interconnected in the digital realm as possible.
Could I add a bit?
Yes.
The sharing of information, it's not technology. Technology does it very, very easily. It is the regime. So if I'm prepared to share information electronically, if the other side says I need a piece of paper, somebody still got to print it out. And you see the chop. So I think that's where the efforts of the DA is important. You say there is an alternative way. And you need to get two sides to say, I can work in a truly digital environment. Then it works.
That agility that Lina was describing there, it is important. We have more questions on this issue of technology and the use of data, because personal data, the use of data, sharing of data, that's a very big issue and a concern for some of our participants out there. So I want to get to this question, and maybe I'll just say that I'm going to throw this one to Alpesh. With the growing attention and controversy even of the use of personal data by the new generation, we've got so much on social media. I mean, we're all data points anyway, aren't we? Whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, we've been kind of reduced to that. This person is asking, how are we going to enable ourselves to better position ourselves to take advantage of that growth, right, as we share this data? We've had a focus on cybersecurity upskilling in past years. Are we going to have more support and recognition to be able to grow personal data protection? I mean, how important is it for us?
Yeah, I mean, number one, of course, it's of paramount importance, and you rightly pointed out, I think cybersecurity, whenever we worked with companies, was, I think, the number one concern. It's still a number one concern, but a lot of efforts have been done to equip companies with a cybersecurity framework and a culture that allows them to be better prepared. If, of course, it's still an arms race, but at least they're better prepared and better aware to face the challenges. When it comes to data, I think everyone and every company sees the value. I think also they see the limitation, dependent on the sector and dependent on how, what types of data are being used, and especially if we look at personal data, the health sector, the healthcare sector is one that stands to benefit the most from a harmonization and clarifications in terms of data protection. Because the main, and I think here we are still in very early days, so there is some basic protection for sure. I think that until there is a real framework and agreement that goes down to levels of details that are actually pertaining to each individual industry and sometimes to individual use cases, this will still take a little bit of time for companies to truly harness the opportunity. And maybe the way to get it started then is typically more to work on a national level first. There are a lot of opportunities, or we call digital enablers, that again can accelerate as a result of the COVID-19 crisis when it comes to telehealth, when it comes to actually the sharing of data to retail, and that data can be geotagging data and so on and so forth. So this can maybe first be worked on at a national level to create those new opportunities and new use cases in the industry, and then see how it can, showing that template of success, how it can work then in bilaterals and then potentially regional agreements.
One of the, I'm going to use the word benefit, but I can't, I can't find too many benefits about COVID-19, I'll be really frank. But one of them has been that, we surprised ourselves at how quickly we could pivot, how quickly we could sort of make agreements with each other and sort of change the way we think. Things that we thought were set in stone suddenly, hey, let's scrub all that out and let's do things a bit differently. And one of them was remotely engaging as well. So Tae Yong, I want to get your opinion on this one, because this is a question that many of our participants have about businesses being able to adapt to engage remotely through these digital platforms. That's one of the most frequent questions that we've been getting. Share with us your experience about how SMEs can actually sort of leverage on these DEAs.
Yeah, so I think that we've seen many successful cases where the SMEs in Singapore and Southeast Asia have transformed themselves during this period as they move from commerce to e-commerce. I think there are many things that don't change. The art of selling, the art of knowing your customers. And these things don't change, but how you do it has changed quite a lot. So as I mentioned earlier, I think the setting up your online shop is really the first step. How you engage your users, how you position your products, product place, price, all the 4 Ps of marketing, all those still applies, but in an online context. So how do you take a nice photo of your product against a nice backdrop? How do you price it right? How do you engage your users through live stream, for example? How do you engage your users through games, for example? And all those require our SMEs to relearn how they operate, relearn their businesses, train their staff to operate in the online world, and be prepared to engage a wider audience who may not be, it's not based on footfall anymore. It's based on online clicks. It's a 24/7 shop. You have to attend to them even when they ask you questions at night. So I think for SMEs and businesses who are able to adapt to all these changes, they will do very well. They'll do very well, and they would exceed even their online, their retail store sales during this period. There are some who are still hesitant in doing so. There's still some obstacle, some barrier.
Tae Yong, what's behind that hesitance, though? What have you seen?
Yeah, so I always say, let's not waste this crisis. Once this crisis is over, once shops open, once we go into phase 3, phase 4, footfall returns. The retail shops will think, oh, life is back to normal. I can depend on this shop once again. I don't need the online shop anymore. And that's where I think the concern is that we don't make use of this time to transform what you do, to open up 2 channels, both online and offline, that I fall back to what I know and not learn the new way of doing business. And that's something that we have been trying to work with IMDA and ESG to try to convince our businesses that this is the time, this will be the future of how you operate, this must be the way you operate in future, that there's no other way. It's not, you don't do this only for now, do this forever. This is how you should operate going forward. This can be your 50%, 2/3 of your income stream in future. And some businesses actually, they realize this. They realize I don't need to pay rental anymore. I can redeploy my staff. My labor cost can be trained to do other things. They train their staff to do live stream. So that's all very different skills. But live stream, if you think about it, is the same as selling to customers in shop, except that you're selling to a camera and to a wider audience. At any one time, you can reach out to 100, 200, 1,000 users as opposed to doing it in shop. So all this, I think, requires a lot of mindset change. I think for the businesses, they have to click and say, okay, I will do it, and I will persevere, I will get it done. And help will come. Help from the government agencies, from online platforms, and fellow sellers. I think there's a huge seller community. If you listen to their success stories, you feel encouraged as well. That the first month or 2 will be tough, will be challenging, but it's not an option anymore. You have to go online.
It's another conversation altogether about what the issue of rental means and remote working. And those conversations are being had already. Ken, were you going to say something?
No, just when he was talking, you just the image of there's been tectonic shift. It's like maybe in your past you used to build corrals for horses. In the internal combustion engine comes along, you still want to build corrals for horses? I mean, you either move or die. And I think that's what COVID has brought about. It's brought it into a life and death situation for companies, and they have to change. They have no choice.
The people who read actual physical books might disagree with you, but the people who listen to audiobooks and read ebooks, remember that, I mean, some people still like to turn the page. But it's getting very, I know, we've lost a lot of very good bookstores, I won't mention any names. So let's get back to, I want to get to Stephen's thoughts on this one, because the Australian-Singapore DEA is fresh in our minds. Mm-hmm. And going back, you did outline some of the part of the 7 MOUs that have been signed. But what I want to know is, and I think some of our participants are sending in this question as well, and I kind of touched on it in the previous panel and with Minister Iswaran. With all the FTAs we have, and now we have DEAs, should we see them as supplemental to FTAs? Are they sort of standalone on themselves? And I know this is a lot of questions, but what do you have to think about or take into account when you see such a volatile landscape right now, the way that it's evolving? How do you actually come to the point where you say, okay, here we go, here's our agreement?
Okay, so yeah, that's an interesting question. I think FTAs, have been going on quite strongly for about over 20 years now, and Singapore has 25. And I think each one is right at the time, and that's why they keep having to be refreshed. I think if you look at the history of FTAs, there's a regular refreshment, and I know with our comprehensive strategic partnership with Singapore, that is refreshed. Is it annually or biannually or something like that? So, and I think it's been mentioned before, the DEA between Australia and Singapore was contemplated pre-COVID. Right, because everybody saw the benefits. Now COVID has happened. It's really reinforced the need for this, but I think it's even highlighted the urgency, even in a stronger way, but also other aspects. And so the fact that supply chains just may not be stable going forward. You may have to have real flexibility. That's a graphic example in a way, and so FTAs really need that. That flexibility to really work around that. I actually really liked the thought from the Minister this morning about think of FTAs, DEAs as really establishing nodes on a network. And what it does is between Singapore and Australia, we're really like-minded anyhow, but we're connecting with like-minded people. And so those DEAs will ultimately make a virtual network as well. So that's going to help Singapore and Australia reach out to other countries. So hopefully I haven't rambled too much, but that's just a few thoughts that come to mind.
And if I can ask you, push you a little bit further on this one in terms of local businesses. I mean, in Australia, how have you prepared them for this, Singapore-Australia DEA?
Okay, so following up on the previous comment, let's not waste a good crisis. I think the Australian government has came out with a budget a couple of weeks ago, and it's really put a lot of plans in place to really educate SMEs, to upskill people, to upskill digital capabilities across the board, government agencies, use technology to reduce inefficiencies in bureaucracy, and also to supplement, I think, the outputs of our DEAs, around the e-basis of invoicing and certification. So there are now grants around for that to make it happen. So it's been a centrepiece of the Australian government, and it'll all, hopefully as the MOUs and initiatives are rolled out, the building blocks, particularly around SMEs and their capabilities, will be reinforced, and it's a chance for them to take advantage of these grants, and that's happening in Singapore now with the retraining, and for the people that don't want to embrace that, they're in for a tough time, and they could be like the blacksmiths on the, looking after those horses in the corral we heard about.
Somebody still needs to shoe those horses, though. The digital economy can't. You need somebody to put the shoes on. Okay, so a lot of our participants are small and medium enterprise owners. I mean, they make up the bulk of our economy. They're very important. They're the lifeblood of our economy. And they'll be watching us now and wondering, what can I do with all of this information? How can I actually use this? What does it mean for me? One of the questions that we have here is about the fact that, yes, we've made strides with FTAs. Now we've got DEAs. How can the SME community sort of leverage on the Singapore brand? I mean, I just want to say that when I think of Singapore brand, I'll be frank. I think of Singapore in itself. I think of Singapore. I don't necessarily have like one specific name that comes up of a company, although there are more now coming up, I must say. But 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you know, that was not so much. So if you do have a Singapore brand, how do you actually use these structures?
Right. Maybe let me put it in this context. The FTAs and the DEAs are sort of the international leg, right, of that flow. But for you to tap on that international leg, first you must get your domestic leg in order, and that is where I think Teck Yong also mentioned the government has put in place quite a lot of schemes and support for you to onboard your business onto digital in the first place. And from there, then what we are trying to do is to make sure that those international legs flow as easily as possible. So I'll just take something like an invoice as an example. The Singapore-Australia DEA has a provision to say that, okay, we commit to have interoperable e-invoicing systems, right? So when you push the invoice across to your Australian counterpart, you don't have to sort of translate it back to paper and then mail it across. But for you to even get on board e-invoicing, you do need to take a step, right? Either talk to your accounting software company or your own enterprise IT and integrate that PEPO ID into your invoicing system in the first place. And there are lots of support structures, grants available to help you to do that. So that's the first point, that you know, you have to digitize your business locally in order to plug into that international link. Now, when we talk about the Singapore brand and how widely it sells, at least from our perspective, talking to government counterparts and business counterparts overseas, the Singapore brand is a very strong brand. And there is a lot of credibility when we come in to say that, you know, we want to harmonize rules, standards, governance frameworks. I think that is where Singapore is very well regarded. To say that, you know, if I put a data protection trust mark, for example, on a company in Singapore, right, you can consider accepting it as something that is compliant with your domestic standard because I have done the necessary checks, we have gone through the process and so on. So these are the kinds of things that we are trying to put in place, leveraging precisely on this Singapore brand, and also the very strong international linkages that we already have built across the years with our counterparts.
Can I add to that?
So, yes.
Can I add to that? So I fully agree. I think the Made in Singapore brand is something that we're all very proud of. And I think we have a few very successful local brands that we have, and they have gone out, they ventured overseas and set up, you know, presence in Asean and globally. But I think the SME viewers would think it is really quite challenging. If they were to do it, it's very challenging for them to venture out to Southeast Asia, not to mention, you know, further abroad. But the opportunity is there. So there's an opportunity and a reality. The opportunity is ASEAN is huge. It's a 600 million population market, is huge. All of them, I think most of the SMEs want to tap onto this market. They know the domestic market is small. They must do well here in order to venture out. But they realize the ASEAN market is huge. But they find it challenging because their resources are not as strong to find the reliable distributors, the channels to sell overseas, and to clear customs and all this. So it's tough. The reality is, and I think digital offers a tremendous opportunity for them to do so. I think platforms like us, we offer the e-commerce, you know, possibilities in those markets. We are now in the process of integrating the different markets so that you can sell across to Malaysia, Indonesia. But the reality is, I think the local brands would first need to embrace digital in Singapore first. So the reality is, do well here, understand how you can operate in Singapore, and then from here, you can really then send and export your products overseas. But in the past, it's a lot harder. You have to set up shops, establish distribution network. But now, it's a bit easier with digital, but they have to take the first step.
digitalization is a pathway, really, isn't it? It's a conduit to all the possibilities that you can actually tap onto. I wanted to get to this point about what you were saying, Tae-yong. Yes, businesses, they might have some insecurity, they might wonder whether they can make it. I mean, it's down to a belief in and knowledge of one's strengths as well. So some companies, interestingly, I mean, small companies, they may not know what their strengths are. They may not know exactly how to tap into their strengths to be able to then use them or more efficiently and so on. Because I always think at the end of all of this, the logistics, the tech, everything, there are your customers, there are people, human beings on the other side who want connection, who want to be able to trust you, right? I was talking to Dr. Thomas Becker from BMW, he's head of sustainability there. And he managed to, not he singularly, but the company during the COVID-19 pandemic managed to convince their customers to buy BMWs from a digital showroom. Okay, so, no, not even go, now, I mean, their showroom is open, everyone. If you're in Singapore, Performance Motors is definitely open. But, they see a future of a digital showroom. It's perfectly fine, but that rests on trust. It rests on this ability to have this connection with your customer. So for the small company, that's so important, right? I mean, you can't just sort of say, I want to go overseas and not know who your customer is overseas or not engage with them overseas. So Alpesh, I want to throw this one to you about this sort of ability to adapt in terms of interacting with your customer.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think when it comes to any type of digital transformation, it has to start from a very good understanding of your existing value proposition and what is making customers, being in a B2C or B2B world, click with your company. The second element is, well, you need to build a strategy, but that is easier said than done. It's a high-level world. But what does that mean? So how do you reimagine your business with now blending or going completely digital? How is it going to look like? How are you going to interact with those customers in such a way that your known value proposition gets reinforced, gets maintained or gets reinforced, and you are able to build on other elements? And actually, having that vision is probably the first and toughest exercise for any company, and also quite tough, of course, when you're an SME. Do you think that you have the time to do that? But there is basically no choice. You have to do this. You have to have that vision, because even as a small and medium company, you'll need to rally your organization behind you, and your resources are limited. So people need to understand where you are going. So that really is number one. I think when it comes to when you reimagine this new value proposition in a digital or hybrid world, that's where you can start translating it into what will look like the new customer journey. As you highlighted earlier, there can be a fully digital customer journey. There can be a hybrid customer journey, or omni-channel, right? Where the part of it is still physical, the other part is digital, and that's what will probably happen in the phase 3, phase 4. We'll probably go more with those type of hybrid channels, and you need to make it seamless in order to really get your customers to stick. So these will be the elements, and only once that is clear, then you can look into what are the strengths and weaknesses in the company. And there will be strengths that, of course, build into your existing value proposition, and there'll be weaknesses that you need to fix, and they will be related to getting the relevant digital talent, getting the culture, winning over the people. And that's basically where companies typically get stuck in what we call a pilot trap. I mean, they get the vision, but then when it comes to implementation, something goes in the way. So it's very important to get some early quick wins there and get the organization to move.
Just to add,
Yes.
I think digital levels the playing field. Small can act like big. Without digital, the small will never have the benefits of the big. So digital, you can use a Shopee platform and you can just act like a big company. So that helps.
And on that point, Ken, then, what are some of the opportunities, for those small companies out there that are listening to us today, what are the opportunities that they can actually sort of look forward to then in, hopefully one day, is we have a post-COVID world?
We will have a post-COVID world. There will be an uptick. I think the companies who are progressive and think beyond physical boundaries are the ones that is going to excel. And I think the companies that know how to work in a network fashion are the ones going to excel. So I think look for partnerships to grow. And digital helps that.
We have just a little bit of time left. Do any of you have some final thoughts? I wanted to sort of, Taek Yong.
Yeah, so I think we talk about the opportunities, of going overseas, and I want to paint a bleak picture also. So we have different SMEs. We have food and retail. For food, I always say it's a captive market. You have to consume food on site here. But for retail, if you are still selling brooms, sorry for the broom viewers, if you're still selling broom, tomorrow your buyers are going to buy overseas. The products are going to come from China, Korea, Japan. I can get a much cheaper, better broom online, and I can just get it through e-commerce. So
Taek Yong, and the thing about e-commerce is that, and if it's not a good broom, I can just send it back.
You can return, yes.
At no cost.
You can change
these
it,
days.
yes. And so there's hardly anyone can be defensive over here. we cannot close our borders. You are really competing against the global sellers. That's true. Even though you're in Singapore. Yeah. So for retailers, if you are not adapting to this, if you're not changing, very soon your buyers will be turning to the global market, even if you don't change. Your footfall may not come back. The competition is really intense. The competition is global. Like it or not, competition is global.
But I suppose the market is also global, so that's the upside as well.
Yes. And on that note, yes, I agree. The competition is intense, and it is global. Panel, thank you very much for carving out some time from your day to be here with me to discuss our topic. Mr. Sorkin Wai, Ms. Kolina, Mr. Stephen Scully, Mr. Alpesh Patel, and Mr. Lim Taek Yong. Thank you very much, all of you. Well, it remains for me to thank everyone for their kind participation in today's event. You've been part of FTA Day 2020 being held here at the Singapore Business Federation. We've heard lots of interesting ideas, we've heard lots of interesting solutions, and had a glimpse perhaps of what the future is going to be as we move into this brave new world of change and adaptation. Don't forget those FTAs, don't forget those DEAs and how you can use them. Remember, knowledge is key and you have to do your homework. Now before I go, just a quick reminder that there is a survey for you to participate in, and it's online, and so please do fill out that survey and get it back to us. We hope you've enjoyed this session today. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, take care of each other. Bye for now.